Did you know that originally Sam was going to tackle Gollum into the fiery depths of Mount Doom? Or that Bilbo was almost the one who killed Smaug? Or that the Rangers of the North weren't going to be men, but wild hobbits? As with all great tales, the finished product rarely looks like the original idea, and Tolkien's epic stories are no exception. Taking nearly 17 years to complete The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien went through dozens of iterations of your favorite characters and plot lines to end up with the epic saga that we have today. And some of these early drafts are absolutely insane. So in today's video, I'm going to reveal the craziest and most interesting early versions of Tolkien's stories. And when you're done watching, I want to know from you whether you think some of these drafts should have been kept in, or if Tolkien had the right idea to keep writing. My name is Gibby, and welcome to Fact or Fantasy, a channel in which we discuss The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, analyzing lore, characters, and more each and every week. Before we jump into the list of Tolkien's first drafts, I want to give a huge shout out to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, Robo Steve, and the rest of my incredible Patreon supporters who help make these videos possible every month. Now let's waste no more time and jump right into our first fun fact here by taking a look at the earliest drafts of The Hobbit. After all, in order to get to The Lord of the Rings, you've got to understand Bilbo's journey first. So how was this book changed? Well, while I'm sure there are hundreds of revisions Tolkien made to the text over the years that he wrote it, today I'm going to just focus on 4 key details. First up, let's talk about the ring. Did you know that in the original version of The Hobbit, Gollum actually offers up the ring as a prize for beating him in the riddle game? That's right, similarly to the version we have now, Bilbo plays Gollum in a game of riddles, but instead of bartering for a way out of the cave, Gollum offers up the ring as a prize. Little did Gollum know that Bilbo had already picked it up earlier on, and Gollum profusely apologizes for not being able to hold up his end of the bargain. He looks and looks for the ring and is very upset that he can't offer it to Bilbo as he said he would. But this brings up an important question. Why would Gollum give away such a precious piece of jewelry? Well, that brings us to detail number 2, which later got changed in The Hobbit, and that is the importance of the ring itself. You see, in the original version of the story, with Gollum offering the ring to Bilbo as a prize, the ring didn't mean anything. Why? Well, The Lord of the Rings hadn't been written yet. So in the early versions of The Hobbit, Gollum says that he received the ring as a wonderful birthday present from his family. And after this, we get further context from Tolkien, which says that Gollum received it during a time when such rings were less uncommon. It was just one of many magical invisibility rings that had spread throughout Middle-earth. Still rare and precious, but not the creation of the Dark Lord. Now for the rest of this video, we'll be talking about the various ideas Tolkien had throughout the early drafts of his writings, but these first 2 details have a unique place in this video, because they actually got published. That's right, Gollum wanting to give away the ring, and the ring not being a product of Sauron were actually published ideas. It wasn't until about 10 years later that Tolkien completely reworked Riddles in the Dark to fit the Lord of the Rings narrative. By the way, as I was researching this video, I found a fun fact online which said that Tolkien originally rewrote Chapter 5 and sent it to his publishers for their opinion, but they misunderstood him sending it and thought that it was meant to be published immediately. So Tolkien got a bit of a surprise as his best-selling book suddenly had a 2nd edition publication without him approving it. I'm not sure how accurate that fun fact is, but if it's true, that's pretty funny. Now moving on, let's talk about the other 2 details from The Hobbit which never made the final cut. And then we'll get into The Lord of the Rings. First, there was an alternate plot in which Bilbo killed the dragon Smaug himself. I know it sounds crazy, but I guess it makes sense as Bilbo is the main character of this tale. According to multiple sources online, the original version of Bilbo slaying Smaug included him jumping into a golden bowl to avoid drowning in Smaug's blood, which is pretty gruesome, but probably accurate. Perhaps a little too gruesome for Tolkien's children's book though. Anyway, thankfully Tolkien thought about this long and hard and decided to add Bard the Bowman to finish off the beast instead. We learned that this decision ultimately came down to the fact that Bilbo isn't that kind of fantasy hero. He solves problems with his cleverness rather than physical strength, so killing the beast would have been a 180 from the rest of the book. The final detail from the original drafts of The Hobbit that never made the cut is that the ending was diplomatic. Back when Gandalf wasn't even named Gandalf and instead went by the name Bloodorthin, he came back to find the elves, men, and dwarves about to fight over treasure, and he talks everyone down. Then he peacefully negotiates a treaty between the three races, and the real battle doesn't occur until later when Bilbo is heading home. That's right, in the first drafts of the finale, Bilbo is waylaid by wargs and orcs as he heads back to the Shire, and that is the real battle at the end of the book. But anyway, now that we've covered all 4 crazy details about Tolkien's first ideas for The Hobbit, let's jump into the bigger story, which is of course The Lord of the Rings. And I'm gonna try to go through these details in a somewhat chronological order, so bear with me. To start, let's look at Frodo and Bilbo. In early versions of the story, Frodo went through many names and identities, one of which almost had Frodo being called Bingo Bolger Baggins. And this wasn't only a name change, but it had Bingo as Bilbo's actual son. I don't think this would have affected the overall story much, but it definitely would have changed the dynamic between Bilbo and Frodo. Staying in the same vein as that first detail, let's move on to number 2, which talks about another character who had a different identity in the early drafts of The Lord of the Rings. Of course, I am talking about Aragorn, who was originally named Trotter, a hobbit with wooden shoes. Some sources say these wooden shoes were actually wooden feet from being tortured in Mordor, and various other accounts state that this character's identity evolved many times, at one point even being Bilbo in disguise. But eventually Trotter morphed into the man that we know as Aragorn. But when changing a character as integral as Aragorn, you get some ripple effects in other parts of the story. And that brings us to detail number 3. This is a funny one because it's just so massively different from the end product we got. You see, if Aragorn the Ranger started as a hobbit, that means that the other Rangers were probably hobbits as well. That's right, what eventually became the Rangers of the North, the Dunedain, the men of Númenórean descent who protected the Shire without praise, started out as a group of wild hobbits. Also known as the Wild Folk, these rangers were essentially hobbit vagrants living in caves on the outskirts of the Shire. Thankfully, that storyline grew beyond the hobbits, and Tolkien expanded the characters to include other races. Now moving on in the story, we come to the formation of the Fellowship. And I have to mention the fact that in the early drafts of the story, the Fellowship did not include all the characters we know and love today. For starters, Legolas, Pippin, and Boromir were absent from the original Fellowship. In the original version, we had Gandalf, Trotter, Frodo, Sam, Merry, Folco, Odo, Glorfindel, and Frar. Frar was the dwarf who eventually became Gimli, and obviously we already discussed that Trotter was Aragorn, but our odd additions are Folco, Odo, and Glorfindel. Although, let's be honest, we all wish Glorfindel would have gone on the quest. Now moving on, we come to some crazy alterations which would have impacted the story in massive ways. Our next key detail from these early drafts is Boromir's betrayal. I know what you're thinking, in the final story we do see a partial betrayal on the part of Boromir, but in early versions of Tolkien's epic tale, this went way further, with Boromir defecting to Saruman. After becoming jealous of Aragorn as the chosen leader of the group, Boromir is enraged and deserts them to join Saruman. He seeks lordship and ends up having a far darker fate than his death at the end of the first book. Let me know in the comments if that's a version of the story you would have liked to see. And as promised, our next detail is also quite astonishing, and that is the fact that Tolkien briefly debated on making Treebeard evil. Yep, our beloved Treebeard, Mr. Fangorn Forrest himself, was almost a bad guy. Christopher Tolkien notes that his father originally had the Ent to be named Giant Treebeard, an evil character who worked for the enemy and was the one who captured Gandalf. Eventually, this role was later transferred to Saruman, and Treebeard was switched to the good side. Boromir's alternate plotline is at least plausible, but this one I just could never accept. Now, before we get into the final and perhaps most insane early draft from Professor Tolkien, we need to talk about a string of details that never made the cut and kind of all fit in the same category. To start, let's talk about Éowyn's original fate. You see, in one version of the story, Tolkien debated on Éowyn dying alongside Theoden after slaying the Witch King. He eventually admitted that this would be too grim an end for this key character and therefore rewrote her to survive and end up with Faramir. But that brings us to another key change, which is that in this same early idea, Aragorn professes his love for Éowyn as she dies in battle. That's right, in an alternate universe, Éowyn and Aragorn would have ended up together. But that brings up the final detail in this string of revisions, and that is that Arwen wasn't included in the original story, hence why Aragorn could be in love with Éowyn. But even after Tolkien dismissed the idea of Éowyn dying, Aragorn still wasn't with an elf named Arwen, but rather he marries Elrond's daughter, Finduilas. As we know, much later, that name was changed to Arwen. But in those original drafts, Tolkien put the focus on Éowyn and Aragorn's relationship, rather than Aragorn and Arwen. And when you think about it, that actually makes a bit more sense. As book fans know, Arwen is barely in the story at all. Her name only comes up a couple of times, and we really only see her once before they get married in the end. Éowyn is much more present and has a lot more interaction with Aragorn from our point of view, so it makes sense that in early drafts, the romance would be focused on them. But now that we've covered all of those early drafts, revisions, and key details, we need to end off with a bang. And boy oh boy would this have been absolutely insane. As I teased at the very beginning of this video, it was in fact a potential ending that Sam would have been the ultimate hero and tackled Gollum into the depths of Mount Doom. As many Tolkien fans know, Sam was perhaps the professor's favorite character, and Christopher Tolkien later notes that his father couldn't bring himself to kill off Sam. As with many of the details we've covered today, it just would have been too dark and grim. And that really seems to be the theme, as many of the early drafts focus on dark endings or evil betrayals, but Tolkien had a way of figuring out how to write the story without the tragic ending or depressing plot twist. He managed to write a fantastic story which isn't cliche or cheesy, but still has the good guys walking home alive and well in the end. On one hand, I think I would have loved to see Sam save the day and either push Gollum in or tackle him into the fire himself. It would have brought more tears to my eyes, and I would have honored Sam forever as a hero. But on the other hand, the story still brings tears to my eyes, and I still honor Sam as a hero, despite him surviving the tale. So I think Tolkien did the right thing in the end. But what do you think? Now that you've heard all of these crazy alternate versions of the story, let me know in the comments which draft is your favorite. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out my series comparing the books to the movies to nerd out with me even more about these beloved stories. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.